And he asked me as if that was a problem. And I was sort of thinking, I think somewhere in my job description, it says something about telling people about how to follow Jesus. So yeah, that's absolutely fine. Let's meet up. So we grabbed lunch a few days later, and he began to tell me his story. He was a middle-aged man, a gay man. He'd been in a long-term partnership for 10 or so years by that stage, I think. And he said, listen, I'm interested in following Jesus. I've just got to know from the outset, what do you guys think about sexuality? What does Jesus think about that? And I remember thinking, that's not where I'd normally want to start with sharing the gospel with someone. I don't really want to start with the Christian view of sexuality. I'd rather cut to the chase and go straight to who Jesus is. But he was asking, what do we think about same-sex relationships? So I tried to walk him through some of the stuff we were thinking about last night, and he listened very patiently, very politely, and he just sort of looked at me for a moment and said, listen, and he'd had a rough life. He'd shared a few of his stories. He'd not had an easy time. But he said, listen, my relationship with my partner is the best thing that has ever happened to me in my life. What could possibly be worth giving that up for? And the question hung in the air for a moment as I thought to myself, that's actually a pretty good question. And I played for time and I said to him, that's a really good question. And I was praying to God at the same time going, hey, that's a good question. Could I have some help here? And the passage that came to mind was Mark chapter 10, verses 28 to 30. And I actually walked him through this passage, and we actually met up for many months after that and continued to talk things through. But this is what Mark 10, verse 28 says. We've just had the account of the rich young man who wanted to follow Jesus, wasn't willing to set aside the things Jesus called him to set aside. So he's leaving disappointed. As we look on, we're disappointed. And Peter decides this is the moment to say, hey, we've left everything and followed you. In other words, don't worry about him, Jesus. You're lucky because you've got us. And, we're on board. What more could you need? You're welcome. Typical Peter stuff. Well, Jesus responds to Peter with this amazing promise in Mark 10, verse 29. He says, truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers, children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. Now, a lot of stuff going on there. Here's what Jesus is showing us. Jesus is assuming we will leave things to follow him. That's discipleship 101. Jesus is always upfront about that. He doesn't bury that in the small print. We will leave things to follow him. Moreover, Jesus assumes the most costly things to leave will be relational and familial. So he says that there may be some who leave house and brothers, sisters, mother, father, children, and lands to follow Jesus. That's not the case for most of us. We don't have to leave all of that to be a Christian. Some people do. There are some cultural or religious or ethnic backgrounds where if you decide you're going to follow Jesus, you will lose your family and your home. You will lose your community. But Jesus also assumes that even if someone has to leave all of those things, that it will be worth it to follow him even in this life. Jesus doesn't say, listen, some are going to have to leave their homes and whole communities, and it's just going to stink, but don't worry because they'll get heaven at the end. No, Jesus says, there's no one who's left all of those things who won't receive 100-fold now in this time and in the age to come eternal life. In other words, Jesus is saying, however much we leave for him, we always receive much more from him, even in this life. And again, he casts this in relational and familial language. There's no one who's left house or brothers, sisters, father or mother, children who won't receive 100-fold now in this time, houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, and so on. So Jesus isn't promising us wealth and riches and a property portfolio. I mean, those things would be nice. But he is saying that in him, we will receive 100-fold relationally. So here's how I want us to translate this. Imagine a thought experiment. Someone, and this is not, there's no kind of, this is not a loaded question. I don't know this church well enough this is not me trying to jab or make a point or something. Just imagine this thought experiment. Someone has come to faith from a gay background and is at this church now. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that their coming Christian means they can't go back into their former community. That's not always the case. It's not often the case. But just imagine in this scenario, that's the case. They can't go back to their community, but they're now here at this church. Jesus is saying that person should be able to say that as a result of being part of this fellowship, that they now have more family in their life than they had before and not less. That they have more community in their life than they had before and not less. They have more intimacy in their life now than they had before and not less. Would that be true? Would someone likely say that if they were in our fellowship here? Because if our answer is, I'm not really sure we're there yet, then we're calling Jesus a liar, because Jesus is saying we will receive 100-fold. What we leave behind relationally, Jesus will replace in godly kind and in far greater measure. So the question for us, and this is a question for any of the churches that we represent, mine included, is how can we be churches that embody that 100-fold promise of Jesus? How can we be the kind of church where someone says, do you know what, I had to leave so many relationships behind to come to Jesus, but now that I'm with this group of people, I have so much more than I had before. Let me walk us through a few things, again, in no particular order. Ways we can be like 100-fold community as a church. Here's the first thing. We need to make these, we need to talk about these issues. We can't just duck them. And the fact that you're doing this thing today and last night is a sign that you're not ducking the issues here at Redeemer. But the reason I say that is because we are being discipled all the time by everything we watch and listen to about how the world wants us to think. The world is really good at discipleship. And so if we're not being taught on these issues, if we're not talking about them ourselves in our families and our small groups and all the rest of it, it's not that we're being undiscipled, it's just that we're only being discipled by the culture around us. So we do need to put these issues on the table, which means we need to make it safe to talk about. We need to make it safe for people to be able to confess whatever issues of sexuality they struggle with. By safe, I don't mean the kind of secular counterfeit of safety, where, safety equals constant unconditional affirmation. No, gospel safety means non-judgmentalism and a sense of we're all in the same boat here, and we're not trying to fix each other. We're actually helping each other to come to Jesus, and he's the one who sorts us out. Safety in a gospel context is where we don't look down on some sins more than others. It's a context where each of us is so aware of the depravity of our own heart that we're not surprised by what anyone else might be struggling with. We're unshockable. Paul calls himself the chief of sinners, the foremost of all sinners in 1 Timothy 1. I love that because there's a trajectory in Paul's ministry where he begins by saying, I'm the least of the apostles. Then later on he says, I'm the least of all the saints. And then he says, I'm the foremost of all sinners. And I think what Paul's showing us is that when we become aware of how much mess is in our own hearts, it's hard for us to imagine there's someone else out there who's more messed up than we are. And if each of us comes with that perspective, we actually become easy people for others to confess their sins to. So we need to make it safe to talk about. Part of that means that we're not defining people by the things that they struggle with. My previous church in England, we had a church member who mentioned to one of my colleagues that he was struggling with his sexuality. And my colleague met up with him a few times and a couple, asked him how it was going. And one time this church member said to him, you do know I struggle with other things, don't you? He said, I'm the CEO of a company, we're doing really badly. I know I'm being a really horrible boss. But you never asked me about that. And it was a fair point. We needed to not define him by that one sin struggle, not make that the lens through which we saw this individual. So we need to make it safe to talk about. Secondly, and this builds on what we were thinking before the break, we need to celebrate a biblical understanding of sexuality. The biblical teaching on sexuality really is good news. Our culture says you are your sexuality. If you're attracted to people of the same sex, that is who you are now. That is defining for you. That is you at your most you. You are gay. This is a category of personhood. And for a lot of people that feels intuitive because they think, yeah, this feels deep within me. This feels defining and personal. This must be who I am. But that's actually bad news for someone. Because what you're saying is if you are your sexuality, then your sexuality has to be going well, has to be fulfilled in order for you to be complete. And that is bad news for two types of people. It's bad news for the kind of person who is feeling like they're not sexually fulfilled. Because saying to them, you are your sexuality, is saying to them, listen, the best in life is passing you by. Your one main shot at being complete and fulfilled is by fulfilling your sexuality, and you're not doing that. And it's only a few short tragic steps from someone hearing you are your sexuality to them thinking that a life without sexual fulfillment isn't worth living. And so when someone says to me, listen, you Christians are why gay teenagers are committing suicide, one of the things I want to say to them is, we're not the ones making sexual fulfillment the be-all and end-all of life. You are. You're the ones raising the stakes so high that teenagers are thinking, if this isn't going well, if I'm not fulfilled in this area, my whole life is wasted. That creed, you are your sexuality, has a body count. So it's bad news for those who are feeling like their sexuality isn't being fulfilled, but it's also bad news for those who think their sexuality is being fulfilled. I've met this college student many times. They're having the kind of sex they want to have with the kind of people they want to have the sex with, and culture is saying to them, hey, this is it. This is as good as life gets. And they're thinking, it ain't that good. This doesn't feel like it's enough. Christianity is good news for us on this because the most fully human and complete person who ever lived was Jesus. Jesus was never married. He was never in a romantic relationship. He never had sex. So, however good those things are in the right context, none of them are essential for being a complete human being, or you're saying Jesus wasn't complete. No, Jesus actually shows us that it's in him we find fulfillment. I tried to talk a bit about this last night. It's not fulfilling our sexual desires that will give us a sense of ultimate meaning and satisfaction. It's actually knowing Jesus. That's liberating because it means my sense of worth and fulfillment and identity isn't contingent on how my love life is going. My marital status isn't the big determination of whether I'm going to be happy or not. It's also good news because of again, what the Bible says about our bodies. I was saying earlier before the break that in our kind of Western culture, your body is just incidental and accidental. It has no bearing on who you really are. That's just who you feel yourself to be deep down inside, which is why in our culture, sexual identity is such a defining and fixed kind of thing. But here's what my Christian theology tells me. I was born male. I will be raised in the resurrection male. My maleness is part of my eternal identity. The same is not true of my sexual feelings. Whatever sexual temptations we might experience, we don't feel them all the time, 24/7. If you do, please see a doctor. And when we are raised in the resurrection, we won't be raised with the same sexual feelings that we experience in this life. Praise God. Which means my sexuality, my own experience of sexual feelings, that is temporal, not eternal. And so I shouldn't invest my deepest sense of significance and identity in what is actually something that is temporal for this life only. Whereas our culture kind of flips this entirely by saying, no, your sexual orientation, that's who you are, that's fixed, don't even think about changing that. Oh, but your gender identity, you can change that every second Thursday if you feel like it. No, the doctrine of the resurrection actually helps me here. I actually think, okay, my sexual feelings, they may feel like a big deal, but they are not my eternal identity. They're not that important. They don't deserve star billing in how I see myself. Again, that's actually liberating. Next, we need to honor singleness. I talked about last night how some people who wrestle with their sexuality are able to marry someone of the other sex. Some people don't. The Lord is wiser than we are on these things. I don't want to be prescriptive as to what someone should do, and the Lord knows best. But at the very least, we need to not be denigrating singleness or implying that it's some kind of second best to marriage. I ran into someone at a Christian conference that I hadn't seen for over 10 years. And we're like, oh man, let's catch up. And I said to her, hey, when I last saw you 10 years ago, your kids were teenagers. So they're in their late 20s now, right? What are they up to? How are they doing? And she said, oh, so-and-so's married and the other one's engaged, so they're both sorted. And I remember thinking, sorted? What does that make me? Am I unsorted? And it's easy for us to think that single people are loose threads that need to be kind of tied up. I know of one church in, I think it was in Arkansas, that their 20s and 30s group was called Pairs and Spares. And there aren't many things that I would happily have the death penalty for, but I think whoever came up with the name of that group just immediately. And it strikes me that we can often treat singleness in church settings as if it's a failure to have fully grown up yet. Now, in some cases it might be. You can be single for selfish reasons. You can be single for immature reasons. But let me tell you, as a pastor, you can get married for selfish and immature reasons too. The issue isn't whether someone is married or single. The issue is, are they being married for godly reasons, and are they being single for godly reasons? And in both cases, we want to honor those who are using marriage or singleness to the glory of God rather than on the altar of, is this going to make me feel self-fulfilled? Marriage is not the goal of the Christian life. One of the things I touched on last night is that our earthly marriages are meant to point beyond themselves to the ultimate marriage of Christ and his church. In other words, your marriage is not meant to fulfill you, but it is meant to point to the thing that can fulfill you. I took a wedding for a young couple a while back, really sweet couple from church, and they asked me to give a short address in the wedding ceremony, so I gave them a mini sermon. And at one point I said, listen, if at some point you find that your marriage disappoints you, please bear in mind that's because it's supposed to. It's not meant to fulfill all of your expectations. It can't. But it does point to the thing that can, which is Jesus. So we mustn't treat marriage as if it's the sort of the more mature, you kind of graduate out of singleness into marriage. I'll often say to single people, there are ups and downs in marriage and there are ups and downs in singleness. And too often we compare the downs of singleness with the ups of marriage, not realizing that there are downs of marriage and ups of singleness. Paul even talks about there being certain advantages to singleness in 1 Corinthians 7. Let me just share this with you. He says, this is so countercultural. Paul talks about those who marry. He says, where is this? Those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 28. Now, that's not the only thing Paul says about marriage. Paul says some of the most beautiful and lofty things about marriage anyone has ever written. But he also says, hey, if you marry, you're going to have some worldly troubles. Maybe don't put that in your, anniversary card to your spouse, but there are certain trials you are spared if you remain single. When you get married, you don't think, okay, well, all my problems of singleness are now solved, and I can just live happily ever after. No, Paul is saying when you get married, you exchange the problems of singleness for the problems of marriage, and the problems of marriage can often be bigger than the problems of singleness. But more than that, Paul also says singleness doesn't only spare us certain things, it frees us for certain things. He says in verse 32 of 1 Corinthians 7, I love this verse, I want you to be free from anxieties. Isn't that great? I want to be free from anxieties too. Me and Paul are on the same page here. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. Now, Paul is not saying that singleness is more spiritual than marriage. He's just being realistic. He's saying if you're married, you're probably being pulled in more directions than if you're single. Life's a bit more complicated. I've seen that. I've seen friends of mine with young kids. I've seen what's involved in them trying to leave the house as a family. And it's like a half-day event, just getting everyone out of the front door at the same time. You've got one kid has got their coat and boots on and they're ready to leave the house. The other kid is in the bathroom. The third kid is entirely unaccounted for. The kid comes out of the bathroom. The kid who's ready is now saying, well, now I need the bathroom. So you're trying to get them ready for the bathroom. The third kid appears but dressed as Batman. And you're like, you can spend whole days just trying to get... There's a way in which sometimes the single life can be a bit more flexible. It's easier to pivot. Some dear friends of mine went through a family tragedy not long ago, and I was able to sort of call in and see them pretty quickly, and I was glad to be with them. But I was chatting with some other friends of theirs, and it made me realize it was harder for the other friends to be there because the other friends had just slightly chaotic family lives and you couldn't just drop everything and go somewhere. And it just made me realize I have a privilege as a single person of being a little bit more nimble. It's easier for me to do something at short notice. It's easy for me to drop everything and give some serious time to a friend in need. And this is Paul's point. He says at the end of verse 35, he wants to promote good order and secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. In other words, Paul is saying the freedoms you might have as a single person aren't there for you to please yourself. That's not so you can be selfish. Whatever freedoms and flexibility you have is so that you can be undivided in your devotion to the Lord. That you can actually use that flexibility to serve the Lord and to serve his people. So we want to honor singleness. Those who are growing up in our churches who may be aware of issues to do with their own sexuality should be able to look out on the church family and think, do you know what? In this kind of context, actually, I can see lived examples of how if I don't end up being married, I can have a great Christian life. Which means next we need to promote friendship. In our culture today, we have really downgraded friendship. We've put all the focus on romantic and sexual fulfillment, and so we've made friendship where we turned friend from a noun to a verb. So you friend someone when you add them to your social media. That's a very Western, recent, and unhealthy way to think. Previous cultures, previous generations and other cultures around the world see friendship as being a much richer, deeper thing than we tend to. And the Bible does as well. We've so collapsed sex and intimacy into one another that we don't have a cultural category now for intimacy that has nothing to do with sex. But the Bible shows us, and experience reflects this, you can have lots and lots of sex and not be experiencing intimacy. I think we see that with David and with Solomon. I think one of the reasons David is so superlative about what his friendship with Jonathan means to him is because David had such a screwed up view of women that what he actually experienced with Jonathan was actual real intimacy. There's nothing homoerotic about it. That's a very immature Western way of approaching that because David has affection for Jonathan. They must be gay. That just shows how shriveled we are in our Western world with how we think about friendship. You can have lots and lots of sex and not be experiencing intimacy. And the Bible also shows us you can have real intimacy that is nothing to do with romance or sex. We see that with Jesus. Jesus had the 12 that he did life with, that he kind of walked through life with. Within the 12, he had the 3 that he seemed particularly close to, that he let in a bit further. And there's a case that with John, he had an even deeper friendship. You see this with Paul. You look at the end of Paul's letters when he's sending the greetings, and don't skip over those. Those are not the end credits. Those are Paul showing you how deeply relationally embedded he was in the lives of other people. And you look through a chapter like Romans 16, which is just greetings, and you realize how deeply affectionate Paul was to his friends. When Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon, in the letter to Philemon, he says, I'm sending you Onesimus, my very heart. Now, it sometimes occurred to me, I'm not going to do this, but it sometimes occurred to me, if I was to put on Christian Twitter that this friend of mine is my very heart, I know exactly what would happen. Paul says to Timothy, I long to see you. Because there's depth of friendship there. He says that my joy may be complete. There's a depth and richness to friendship in the Bible that we've lost in our culture today, and we need to regain for all our sakes. In the Bible, a friend is someone who knows your soul. A friend is someone who knows what's going on the inside of your life. A friend is someone who just knows instinctively how they can be praying for you. They don't need to, they hear something's happened in your life. They don't need to talk to you to know how to pray for you. They just think, oh man, if that's happened, he must be feeling this way. I need to pray for him. The book of Proverbs shows us we can't be wise without friends. And for those of you who are married, you need friendship as well. We recently did a series on friendship at our church, and I interviewed a couple of older saints about life and friendship, and each of these individuals was married. And we hadn't rehearsed this. I didn't know what their answers were going to be, but I said, what do you know about friendship now that you didn't know in your 20s? And both of them said, I didn't realize how much I would need friendship in marriage. And one of them said, I really regret not having kept my friendships as deeply when I got married. I remember one of my closest friends in England, when he was engaged, and I remember him telling me he just got engaged, and I was so happy for him, engaged to a really wonderful Christian lady. But I also said to him, listen, I'm thrilled, but I'm going to miss that we won't get as much time together. I said, I just want you to know I'm going to miss that. And he said, yeah, I'm going to miss that too. But then he said, I think I'm going to need your friendship more when I'm married than I have done up until now. So he said something like, we may not see each other as much, but I'm going to need your friendship more than I have done in the past. It was dawning on him what being a husband meant, and he was like, I need some help. I've seen marriages implode because they didn't have friends. And we've lost the art of this in our culture today, which means it's all the more important for us as churches to be places where friendships are kind of easily cultivated, where we can really promote friendship. Again, someone needs to grow up in the church, looking around them thinking, in this body of people, your marital status is not what determines whether you are with people or whether you are lonely. Hopefully they're looking around at a healthy church thinking, actually it doesn't make any difference if I'm married or single. I'm going to have a lot of people in my life here either way. Which means finally, and this is circling back to where we began with Mark 10, we need to remember that the church is family. Jesus is promising there in Mark 10 that we will receive through him family. Jesus gives us mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters in Christ. And it's easy for us to look at Jesus making that promise and to think, oh, that's great. Yeah, I love how Jesus does that. But here's the thing. This promise involves us. Because we are the fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters that Jesus is promising. We're meant to be being that for one another. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul says, I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. So two pictures Paul uses to describe the church. The first is the church is a pillar and buttress of the truth, because the church is God's outlet for his truth in the world today. If you take away the church, the truth has no access point into the world. So the church is the pillar and the buttress of the truth. But secondly, the church is the household of God, the family of God. And those two ideas go together. For the church to be an effective outlet for the truth, it has to be an effective family. The credibility of our gospel witness does significantly rest on our relational health. Jesus says, by this will all people know you are my disciples, not by how cleverly you articulate the gospel, but by your love for one another. There's meant to be a relational dynamic in the church that you cannot find anywhere else. So one of the things I frequently pray for is that there be people kind of looking in on our church in Nashville who would think, I really don't like what those guys believe, but I've never seen a community like that before. One of my friends often says the church is not simply a new community, it's a new kind of community. So one of the things I would want, if someone comes to faith from a gay background and comes to our church and gets involved, I hope a watching world would be able to conclude, whatever they think of our beliefs, that person has more love in their life by being a member of a church than they would have had by being in a gay relationship. That's our calling. If that becomes true, I think we will find we have a greater impact on the world around us.